All right, so welcome everybody to this session on the all-new Adobe Captivate. If you are in this session, you were very likely familiar with what Adobe Captivate is, but just as a refresher or just as an introduction, if you are new and you do not know what Adobe Captivate is, it is an e-learning development software that is available for Windows and Mac devices. The previous versions were slide-based, just like PowerPoint, the drill of creating content with PowerPoint, and it had some additional e-learning functionality. It's a very robust software for e-learning development, including all the bells and whistles for interactivity and accessibility compliance. Like I said, and emphasized, the previous versions were slide-based, and this new version is slide-based-ish, which means that there is some flexibility as to what you can do, and there are some advantages and disadvantages to that approach that I'm going to cover in this session. Now, the design approach for the new Captivate is completely different from previous versions, which is what prompted us to offer this session on the new Adobe Captivate. Alexis and I are here not necessarily as experts on the software. Captivate was released last Thursday, so it's been a little under 7 days. We've been experimenting with the software and its functionality, try to take the software to the limit, and especially taking project requirements for e-learning authoring and development, storyboarding, and scenario-based learning. All of the courses that we have in the Opal program where you might be using Adobe Captivate, we've been experimenting with that functionality so that we could bring this session to you just covering exactly just that. Like I said, it is an entirely new tool, but it is still under the same name, Adobe Captivate. So if you go to the Adobe Captivate website, you will see this screen where you can watch an introductory video about the functionality of Captivate, start your free trial, or subscribe for $34 a month. I also want to emphasize that one of the unique aspects of Captivate that distinguishes it from some of its competitors is that it does have a monthly subscription option. Some other tools, you have to get an annual subscription, whereas Captivate, you can pay month by month. If you scroll down the page, you will see some information about the new Captivate, introducing some of its features and some of its design functionality. Tutorials are still being added to the Captivate database. Some of the core tutorials on navigating the interface are already there. You're welcome to check those out. We'll also cover a lot of those features and functions in detail in this session. So this is all for the website component. We are going to now shift to our Adobe Captivate interface. So starting out, this is the first screen that you see when you open Adobe Captivate. You're given the option to start a new project, to start a new simulation, which essentially is a recording demonstration of a software, a demonstration, any type of screencast that you want to be doing. Adobe Captivate also offers some templates on diversity and inclusion, leadership communication, and I do believe that since it's just been released, those are the only 2 templates that are being offered at the moment. 3, actually, because we also have the product onboarding course. And my assumption is that they're going to be adding more templates as the software is further developed and as the community grows around the tool. You'll also have the recent files. Those are a couple of files that we have been experimenting with. Those files are also present in the Your Projects section. And you also have here a link to all of the tutorials associated with Captivate. Like I said, some of these tutorials have already been populated. Some of the content is already there. but the more complex content, such as branched interactions, that content is still to be done and to be added to the Captivate website. We're going to cover some of those actions and especially what you have to do for Opal class projects in this session. Like I said, we can go to the home and create a new project. I'm actually going to start from a project that I already created and I already have open here. And first of all, I just want you to take it in. The first time looking at an interface is overwhelming. And this is very different from what Adobe Captivate used to look like. This is a lot more similar to what Adobe software, and here I am saying the modern software like Adobe Fresco, the new tools that have been developed recently, this is a lot more in line with what those tools look like. It's rather minimalistic, which works in some ways and in some ways can be a little bit limiting. Now, let's go over the interface. So you will see that everything is icon based. We have here a home button, a new slide button. If you click on this button, you have different slide templates that we can choose from. We're going to come back to this option in a minute. We have different text blocks that you can add for paragraphs, multi-column content lists, for instance, different media blocks for different types of media, images, different characters for character conversations, slide videos, multiple videos on an image on a slide, quotes, SVG slides for vector images. We have more specific options for interactive components, such as buttons, input fields, radio groups, drop-downs, and checkboxes. Complex widgets that have some of that more interactive functionality. So a nice thing is that you don't have to build those from scratch. There are already cards in there, tabs, carousels, timeline widgets, and so on. And here we have another option for capture. So to record a software simulation, essentially record what you're doing on your screen, you can press that button. Now we're going to go step by step on the components of the screen. For now, we're just focusing on the adding content component. And we're going to go ahead and create a new slide. So we're going to click on the introduction. And you'll see now that the slide has been populated with this slide template. So here you see that you have other design options. So if I want to change this design option, we can choose from these predefined design options. We can change the background color. For some reason, it's not working at the moment, but that is okay. In the ideal world, and I said we're still experimenting, in the ideal world, the background color would change. We can come here on the slide and you will see that on the right side of the page, on the right side of the interface, we have these options for slide customization essentially. And here I'm going to pause and say these are the only slide customization options that are going to be available for a certain block. So if you add a title on the screen, if you add an image on the screen, there are predefined ways that you can manipulate that block. And you have different components that you can add to it. So for instance, we can add a card background behind this title over here. We can add a button under it and choose the number of buttons, but essentially the design itself, the visual design itself cannot be changed, at least not to a complex level as you would in a tool such as Articulate Storyline, Canva, or even PowerPoint. Going to the bottom of the screen, you might have realized here that we also have a timeline component. So if we expand this over here for image group 2 is the name that Captivate has associated with this component that we have on the screen, this Taru component that we have on the screen, and that name cannot be changed. So it is going to be image 2. If we double click on it, it is not going to give you the option to rename it. You just have to remember that this is the name of the component. You can stretch that timeline to make the components appear at a certain time during the slide. You can add narration, which will extend even more the timeline. It will expand the timeline with the media that you selected. We'll go over that in a minute. But essentially, all of the timings of the components on the screen, you will be able to adjust them here on the timeline. So these are all of the components associated with image 2, which is our component over here. Now let's click on the button here to make this button appear on our screen so I can go over the other functionality on the right side of the screen. So left side of the screen, to add content, just summing up, adding text blocks, adding media blocks, adding interactive components. And the right side of the screen is to manipulate content. So here is where you're going to add any interactions. And for now, we have a button here for an interaction. We'll go back to it in a moment. We can add animations. So if you want to customize the look and feel of how this button comes into the screen, you can certainly do that by selecting this animation option over here. We can, for example, tell it to scale in, and if we play the slide, the button will scale in. We have an option to add audio. You can add audio especially to elements on the screen. You can add an audio that will play when you select or press this button, or you can add an audio to the slide as a whole. You can add audio from assets, pre-existing assets on Captivate, from your system, audio that you have on your computer. You can record audio using Adobe Captivate itself, and you can generate text-to-speech with basically inputting text and turning that into robotic audio narration that you can also use as a basis for creating closed captions. We also have some accessibility functionality here that Alexis will cover in her segment of the presentation. But for now, we're going to go over the interactions. Click on our button here that we created and explore what we can do with this button. So there are many options for button interactions in Captivate. You can select it to go to the next slide. So if you have a next button, that is the option that you would choose. You can set it to show a component on the screen. You can apply an animation by pressing that button. You can toggle a view. If we click on more here, we have lots of other options of interactivity that you can, of things that you can do by pressing this button. For now, we can set this button to go to next slide. Here, we can set a transition. So if we want there to be a transition after this slide is done, before it goes to the next slide, we would set it over here and not on the next slide that we are targeting. We also, if there is an animation transition, we can set the duration. So for instance, if we need this very slowly, and you see the transition here, can take up to 2 seconds and even longer than that if you need a bigger transition. There's also a delay, so if you want it to wait for some interaction or for some animation to finish before proceeding to the next screen, you can set a delay over here as well. We are done with this button so far. Like I said, we're not going to do anything special with it for now. It is just for demonstration purposes. Another thing that I want to emphasize is that even if we're not able to change the design specifically of the buttons or its position on the screen, we are able to edit the text. So if we double click on the button here and we type, for instance, start, then that is a start button. If we go back to the visual properties, we can also change some of its positioning on the button itself of the text. We can put it in bold, italics, and all of that, increase the size. So there is some aspect of design flexibility within the blocks themselves, within the elements of the screen themselves, not so much when you want to move those objects per se on the screen. Now, let's go to a little bit more functionality. I'm going to go ahead and, if you remember last time, we went to the process of adding a new slide and we added the introduction slide. This time, we're going to go to the media blocks here and select an interaction. And here I'm going to choose the two characters interaction. And here's our background. So our background is finally back. That background color that we selected is back. It's there. I'm not going to change it. I don't know what I did, but it looks good enough for me. So you may have noticed that we had a slide here. We had a standard slide size. We had a standard title screen with the course name, author's name, and a button. If I add a component, it will simply expand that slide. You can go forever. The slide size is not fixed. It is expandable. The more elements you add on the screen, it will give you the option to scroll down. It will give you the option to scroll down as much as you want, which is an advantage if you have a lot of content on a specific slide that you don't necessarily want to break down. But on the other hand, consistency is damaged with that approach, because if you don't have equal slide sizes, sometimes that is going to cause confusion in the user experience. Now, in our media block, we have customization options as well. Like I said, we can change and manipulate those objects as they appear on the screen. So for instance, we can increase and decrease the number of characters. The limit for us, unfortunately, here is 2. If we change it to 1 character, only the 1 character and the 1 speech bubble is going to remain on the screen. We also have some other design options. The only 2 design options that we have for this slide are these 2 over here. We can change the design components of elements on the screen. We can, for instance, check how many speech bubbles there are. So if only 1 character is saying something, you would delete the other speech bubble to avoid confusion. You can change some of the colors of those elements, not just for the appearance in general, for the color of the background. You can change the colors and the borders for the speech bubble as well. And another thing that you can do is add a previous and next button. So these elements will appear on either side of the screen, and you are able to customize them as well as needed. So if we press here the other design option, A cool thing that it does is that it already renames it as a default because this is a predefined button. What we're changing here is the design of this button, and Captivate already knows what to do, which sometimes is very nice. So we'll add these two buttons for now, just to show you what this functionality is and how these buttons work. And we're going to proceed to more interactive components. So we went over this in the interface walkthrough, but we have here interactive components that are specific input fields, radio groups, drop downs, buttons, essentially elements that are going to be added to the interface for the sole purpose of interaction. There's not going to be anything around it. There's not going to be any other components that are going to cause visual confusion. This is what you get, basically. We're going to go ahead and add buttons. And here, if we go to select this element on the screen, you see here that we have different options for the buttons. Again, we can enable a card that puts a background behind it. We can change how many buttons we want, and we have a very clear and very strict limit of 3 buttons for this interaction. We can adjust a little bit of the visual presentation of these buttons as far as alignment and spacing. So if you want these buttons to be a little bit more centralized on the screen, you can certainly do that. Fair warning that if you change the text on these buttons, it won't necessarily remain the same size. So if you have, for instance, more text in a button than in another button, the button sizes are going to be inconsistent. And personally, I have not yet found a way to increase that consistency within Captivate, but a more experienced user might prove me wrong down the line, or Adobe Captivate might add that functionality down the line. One of the things that we do in our classes is require branching for some projects, especially if you're taking Opal 523, e-learning, authoring, and development, or Opal 551, scenario-based learning and storyboarding. Those classes have an element of branching e-learning, which means that your module is not necessarily going to have a clear linear progression, but users will have the option of interacting with buttons, which will take them to different slides that are not necessarily associated with any type of linear progression. That is just a very long way of saying that you can customize buttons to go not only to the next slide, but choose specific slides for this button to go to. So if I don't want this button that I created to go to the next slide, immediately the next slide, I can click on Go to Slide, and here you will see a thumbnail of all the other slides that I have on this sample project that I created, and I will pick one slide at random. So let's go to this introduction 3. So after clicking on this button, I will go not to the next slide with the cat video, I will go to the introduction 3 slide that is basically 3 slides down the line. I click done, and this is basically all that you have to do for branching. Now, if you are an experienced articulate storyline user, you might be a little bit confused because nothing has changed on the screen, on the interface specifically. Articulate Storyline has a feature called Story View, and Articulate Storyline shows the branching of elements as the progression. It has a very nice visual representation of how the progression of content is, regardless of the slide progression, but Captivate does not have that functionality yet. So my recommendation is if you want to include any type of branching in your modules, that you keep track of your branching, that you keep track of any complexity that goes away from a linear e-learning perspective on a separate planning document, either that is a flowchart or a separate storyboard, which some of you might be learning how to do in OPAL 551. Without further ado, I will delete what I created here for this demonstration, and I will just show you an example of, I just use this cat video just to try and figure out how videos work within Captivate, but this slide will make my life a little bit harder for demonstration purposes. So I will go ahead and delete it, but it's a very nice cat video included in the assets of Adobe Captivate that I encourage you to check out. So whenever you're creating training in Captivate, you have the option to preview whatever you were doing on the screen by clicking the preview button on the top right corner over here. And basically what it's going to do is open a new browser window. You click on play. So when you preview a Captivate training module, you will see this screen over here. This is the slide that I created. I named it Recruiting for Local Governments Scenario, so a basic scenario on that subject. And you'll see here at the top that we have different display options. So we can expand it to take the full screen. We can change it to a desktop mode. We can change it to a tablet mode, and we can change it to a phone mode. So this is one of the bigger advantages of the Captivate approach, the template-based e-learning development approach that this new version of Captivate is based on. No matter the template that you select, no matter the block you select, there is going to be at least some built-in functionality to make your training consistent and viewable, at least to a certain level of visual cohesion across different devices. So you're going to be able to go through this content whether you are in your desktop, whether you are in your tablet, whether you are on your phone. So this is a big advantage of this approach, in spite of any limitations that we might have for visual complexity or for dragging elements on the screen. That is unfortunately a trade-off that we have to deal with when using this new version of Captivate. I have a button here to advance this slide, and I'm just going to click on here to begin. I don't know if you were able to hear it, but I had some audio on that previous slide. So you can add audio by following the steps that I provided. In that case, it was just a text-to-speech audio using my own voice that I used the script to create. The script is a AI audio editing tool that I encourage you to check out, especially if you're developing prototyping e-learning. It's a very interesting thing to try out for audio placeholders specifically. Going forward in the scenario, we have a basic introduction here, just a very quick explanation, a very quick introduction of the two characters. As you can see here on the screen, we have a background and two different characters that are provided by Captivate. So these are characters that are present in their asset repository. One of my obstacles when developing this was that I was really interested in moving these elements on the screen just so that the characters weren't fluctuating in the environment. But unfortunately, we're not able to drag these objects as of right now. So this is the visual identity that I was going for. We have just a quick dialogue, and upon pressing the next button, we have the first question for this scenario. I want to pause here and just talk about the importance of providing clear and concise instructions for navigation, at least in this present version of Adobe Captivate, because as you can see here, we do have a scroll bar on the right side of the screen if I just linger on it for a little bit. But that scroll bar disappears after a couple of seconds. If a learner is looking at this slide for more than a couple of seconds and doesn't really understand what's going on, doesn't really understand how to navigate a new Captivate interface, they might be confused as to what they have to do exactly to proceed. So in our case, we're telling learners to scroll down to continue because there is more to this slide at the bottom. So we have our scenario here. Just for context, I shamelessly created this scenario using ChatGPT based on a previous workplace content that I've had to develop in my professional life. And I just prompted ChatGPT to create a basic scenario with three different questions for just these demonstration purposes. And here we have three different options for responses. So in these responses, you will see a demonstration of what I talked about when discussing buttons. So the more text you have, the more space that button will take on the screen, essentially. So for the first button, we have a lot of text, so that button takes a lot more space on the screen than, let's say, the third button, and we'll click on one just so you can see what happens here. So we have some ramifications of that interaction and the follow-up after I select that response. And we have some instructional feedback at the bottom. So rinse and repeat for each and every option. Each and every option goes to a different slide. And as you can see here as well, I don't know why the screen closed, but just continuing on the reasoning, you can also change the character's visual expression if you're using the characters from the Captivate asset repository. So we have characters with pensive faces, we have happy characters, we have stressed out characters. So anything that you need to do to create visual components for e-learning from beginning to end is going to be included in Captivate one way or another. I will say that there is a lot of room for improvement at this moment in their asset repository, but this might be just because the software has just been released. Captivate works on a subscription format, and the assumption of a software like that that works in a subscription format is that there's going to be continuous improvement. Fingers crossed that more resources, more functionality, and more flexibility is added in future iterations of this product. The very last thing that I want to cover before I hand things off to Alexis so that she can cover some assessment and accessibility options in Captivate is customization options for the player. So if you're familiar with e-learning development software, usually there is a player around the content that you develop that basically helps you with navigation, built-in options for navigating slides, for embedding accessibility, such as closed captions, providing transcripts of text on text narration. And the way you do this in Captivate is by clicking on this TOC, Table of Contents and Play Bar button. So if you click on that button, if we go to Play Bar over here, you can see that I have that disabled by default for this specific e-learning object because I do have those buttons embedded on the screen environment. I always recommend that you use one or the other, just on-slide buttons or the navigation buttons, just for consistency purposes and for clarity of navigation. You can enable and hide buttons, predefined buttons. So you can enable the play button, the back button, the next button, the mute button, closed captions, and also enable a table of contents. And we also have to enable the table of contents here for it to show up. Basically, if you have any e-learning modules that learners don't necessarily have to follow a specific order, you could enable the table of contents and basically drag those elements. Dragging actually doesn't do anything. I'm sorry, we can move it down, we can move it up, but dragging is unfortunately not an action that you can take at the moment. But you can move these elements up, you can move those elements down in the table of contents, and you can indent and create different groups for those elements as needed. In our case, we're gonna disable that table of contents entirely and our play bar as well, because as I said, we have those buttons on the screen and we don't want to cause any confusion. You also have, and this is the last thing that I'm going to cover specifically that pertains to the software Captivate as a whole, the functionality, is the project properties. You can change the theme, you can change the different colors of the general look and feel of Captivate. You have here different variables. So if you're creating different branching, if you're creating more complexity in e-learning, you have an option to use variables as well. If you've used previous versions of Captivate, or if you're a storyline user, you're probably very familiar with variables. You can import and add background audio that is going to play across your module. I do not recommend that approach just because it decreases the control that you have over each and every element that you have on each slide, but that is something that you can certainly do when you develop e-learning with Captivate. You have an option to show closed captions. If you have captions in your module, you basically just toggle this to show closed captions in your module. And you also have the option to show or not show the play bar, which is really important. I strongly recommend that you always show the play bar so learners can go back and forth, especially if you have any animations on the screen or any audio on the screen that plays at a certain time. You want to give learners the option to go back and forth and listen to content at their own pace. All right, these are the options for actually creating content in Adobe Captivate in a nutshell. These are most of the things that you will have to do for the actual Opal classes. Most of the actions that I covered here are things that you're going to do for class projects in one way or another. And something else that might be of interest to you, especially students that are enrolled or are thinking about taking the e-learning content and management systems course, our Opal 525, is the exporting options. To export your Captivate training, this is hidden. It's a little bit of an Easter egg in this current version of Captivate, but you have to click on these three dots over here to publish your module or to generate a device preview. If we click on publish, you will be given this option. You can publish as HTML, and that is the only option given, but worry not, we're gonna solve that issue really quickly. We can choose the location and name our project, choose a project title. For now, let's close that. Like I said, you're going to be exporting it as HTML, And one question that you might be having is, where is SCORM? Where is XAPI? How do I turn on reporting for this e-learning project? We will go to Edit, Preferences, and here is where that is going to be set up. It is a little bit hidden as well. So the way that what we're going to do is go to Quizzing and then choose Reporting. And that is how you enable e-learning standards for your Captivate exported files. So here in this drop-down menu, I've already exported this to XAPI and tested out SCORM functionality as well using SCORM Cloud, and it works. It is rather rudimentary at the moment because it does not recognize slide names that I have attributed to different slides, but it does track the experience to a very simple level. And that is all for me at the moment. I will stop sharing my screen and I will let Alexis jump in for the next part of the session.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be going over the accessibility and assessment types. I created just a little job aid, so I'm going to go ahead and share that. I was just created via Canva, and I apologize. It doesn't seem as though Canva will allow you to download it. We're going to be sending out a PDF version of this whenever we send out the recording. So again, just apologize, and you'll just have to go along with that if you would like to. But it's basically just going to be reviewing what is going to be happening on the screen. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. Alrighty, so this was just the little tiny module that I created, and just starting with accessibility. So as previously mentioned, we'll just go over here to view our accessibility icons, the little person. And these are the two primary accessibility items that are provided immediately. And this is for like the slide view. So you'll be on a slide view instead of just a specific object view whenever you're clicking this kind of gray, darker gray area outside of the slide. So that's what we're doing. And right now I have tested out this slide accessibility little box, and it seems as though whenever you use it on a screen reader, that it just says that text and it doesn't necessarily override anything, but it doesn't necessarily help either. We're going to go ahead and probably just advise just clicking this little caret and ignoring this for the moment, just because it doesn't really, again, help with the screen readers. And so going down here to the reading order, this is what we're going to primarily talk about. So we see our tab order, and that's essentially what a screen reader is going to read in that order. And so you can see whenever I hover over these different little boxes that different things are highlighted on the screen. So I'm highlighting over this text _16 and the title is highlighted. So that's how you can tell what you're addressing as far as your accessibility. And right now it's just hovering that little text box. And if this were something that maybe we didn't want the screen reader to read, of course, we do want them to read the title of the slide, but say it was some sort of decorative thing that doesn't really add context, you can actually just click hide from screen reader, and then it will actually go down here. So just below that to the hidden, and that way the screen reader will not read this item. But if you did that by accident, you can also just retoggle it and it'll pop back up here to the top. So with this sort of new, I guess the new way that Captivate has used this sort of template base, it is nice for accessibility purposes because once you add a new item on screen, the screen or tab order will be correct. So you can just go down and double check that. So everything looks right. So that's a really wonderful perk. You will, of course, need to add in your own alt text for your images that are context ready for your module. If people who are using screen readers, have low visibility and they cannot see the image and they need the context, you just use this little box here. Again, we can see that we can see that it's highlighted. I guess that's a poor picture. So we can look at the middle one and see that it's highlighted, and you'll see this little image icon. So that's telling you that image belongs to this text box. And so you would just write your text here. And that's essentially all you need to do to have the alt text, which is really easy. And whenever you click out, it's going to stay there. So it automatically saves. And so that's just generally what we have for our accessibility as far as like images and slides. I'm going to go ahead and now talk about the other accessibility item, which is closed captions. So we're going to use the audio icon that Rafael had previously alluded to. Again, if we click import, and generally we'll go ahead and use our own. So we'll click system, and then we'll upload our audio. We're given just a couple of different ways to customize. So we can check our audio file here to make sure it's correct. We have the name. And then we have a fade in option. So if you want it to maybe play a second or two later after letters are on the slide, it'll do that. Depending on your slide length and just different interactions, maybe you want it to fade out. You can also loop it. And those are the primary customizations you can have. And regarding adding captions, so something to note is that you're unfortunately at this time not able to import maybe like a script that you had uploaded or would like to upload. So if you have your script in a Word document like other tools, you cannot upload that. So you do actually have to manually type in your captions. So that is a little time consuming. So just be aware of that. So what you do is you click the Add Captions button, and you're presented with this screen. So I have this text here also from ChatGPT. So this is what our on-screen text would be, our captions. This is what the narration of the slide would be, which is the audio that I uploaded. And essentially what would happen is you click here to start typing. And so we would just type out what the narration was saying. So welcome to our e-learning module. And essentially you'll just have to listen to the audio and see what happens next. If I did click out of it, which frequently happens, see it's connected to a paragraph. So if you do click out of it while you're doing your captions, which I do all the time, if you just click out onto this darker gray area, you can go back to edit. And if you weren't finished typing, then you can continue typing. Essentially, that's how you would include one caption, and you could play your audio to make sure that it's matching up well. And if you had more captions to add, then you would just click this little button that says Add New Caption, and it will just continue adding captions onto the video. And then you could do the preview, or you could play and your captions will play. So you can just make sure that they're adding up and synced well that way. You can also change over here. We have our just general text editor. So you can change the font of the caption, and you can also change the size, which is nice. So as a general good rule to follow, we want to make sure that we're not using more than 2 lines of captions just on a video at a time. We don't want to take up too much space and cover too much of the content. Always good to take a look at that as well and add in an entire sentence maybe at a time. But if the sentence is running a bit long, then you can just add the different caption, add the second caption, and then continue on with the slide. And so that's generally how you add captions. And you can also go here to edit if you have to edit your audio, and then it also just gives you these little options to delete it if you have to include different narration. And so that is pretty much it for closed captions. I believe you can change the length of the captions as far as how long they stay on the video on the screen or on the slide screen. I haven't been able to make that work, but hopefully that changes soon, because right now you just have to kind of line it up with how fast the narration is going. So hopefully they fix that, or you can change it on a timeline. But moving forward, I'm going to go into the next part, which is integrating the quiz slides. To do that, you'll use this little blue arrow up here that Rafael had used earlier to create the content slides, but you will just go down here to question slides. And there are currently 5 different templates that they already have. So there's multiple choice, a true or false, match the column, which is like a drag and drop. We have short answer and then sequencing. And so I'm just going to show you the very basic multiple choice. So this is the standard template that you're given for multiple choice. With these, you can change the look. They have the similar text editor that you'll see on the right. You're not able to delete them, which is unfortunate. I think if you didn't want as much text there, you just have to keep it for the moment. Of course, you can type over this. I think this question 1 of 4 is pretty stationary, but other than changing the preset ways that it can look, it's pretty much there. And so you'll just have to write your question here, and then your question options, your answers go here. I'm going to go ahead and just show one that I've already edited, and I'll show you sort of the differences between this template and what I'd created. So we have our question here. I was able to just copy over the template and write what I needed for the text. And then you click on just the options, and then you can just write your new answer here. Just text as normal. So you'll notice that for the original, it gives you 2 options, but you might want learners to have more than 2 options. And so that's when you would go over to the right side and start looking at the question properties. There's also just a little bit about alignment and spacing up here, as we'd seen previously with like buttons. And so you can play with that a little bit, but for the most part, we'll just go into the different properties. So they have a couple of different question types. So they have graded, and then they have knowledge checks. And the biggest difference is that obviously with the graded, it's if you want your learners to be graded for your SCORM files, whereas for the knowledge check, they're not actually graded. That's just something to keep in mind depending on your learner needs. We have an option for multiple answers. So it's a very slight change, but if you click this, then you'll notice, hopefully, maybe it's a bit small on the screen, but these are little they're squares now instead of what they're now circles. So if this is clicked, then they turn into squares, and then learners are able to choose as many answers as they can. And here is where I was able to change the answer options. So you can have as few as 2, or I guess you could probably do 1 with custom, but it starts with 2, goes up to 5, and then it starts to become custom. So you can put in your preferred number of answers. There is a little button here if you want to shuffle your answers, and that's basically if you want learners to interact with the module multiple times. If you don't want them to see the answers in the same order each time that they enter the module, then you can click shuffle, and as long as it's blue, then that's active. And then we have just some numbering. We have our attempts, points. There is a time limit as well. And those are just a couple things that you can implement to make the quizzes unique. And then here's where you would just note what the correct answer is. So you just click on the correct answer. And once you click done, then it will save that. And then, of course, if you had multiple answers, you would click everything you needed. That would be considered correct. And then you click done as well. Down here, it's just some different design options. And then there's also options to integrate like a card look. You can also make 3 different buttons on each quiz question as well. So there's a skip button, a clear button, and a back button. I don't think you can change how those buttons, or maybe you can if you click on the button. Yeah, if you want to change how the buttons, you can click on them. But for right now, we'll just go back to the actual quiz. There's appearance, so just selecting sort of the background, and then there's also a reporting function. But the other big thing to mention with the quiz questions is what they call a caption. So caption is essentially feedback. And basically, so if we were to have our time limit pop back up, this is what is called the caption, this red area up here, and that's the feedback. So if we click it, we can start customizing all of our feedback. So we're given this little template-y options to have feedback. So we have 4 right now. If we have a correct, which is green, incorrect, which is currently red, incomplete, and a timeout, which you would have, of course, if you had the time limits. So you can customize this. So you can change the color and you can change the text if you want to say something other than correct. Okay, you can go to the next question. So you can add whatever you would need, and it's going to be pretty much the same for all of your correct responses. You'll just receive this feedback, I believe. Something I thought was interesting was I was thinking for incorrect, they do have a way to add a link. And so maybe if you have your incorrect feedback here, obviously you didn't need to change the color because you can't really see the text anymore. But if you did have incorrect feedback, you could add a link, and that could be like an external resource that you could add in for your learners to access. So I did think that the link addition was interesting, and I believe that can be added to all of these feedback items, or maybe just the correct one. Yeah, and it will turn the text blue if you do use the link, so just be cognizant of that. And I think that is it, other than, again, just the very basic text variations you can do. You can also change the position of this feedback, so you can do it in the middle, or you can make it be at the bottom, so you have that customization. But those are pretty much the big ones as far as the quiz questions. I think that's all I have.
Thank you, Alexis. So we spent an hour covering some of the experimentations with Captivate that we've been doing over this past week. As you may have noticed, this is pretty much still a work in progress. My first impression, the first time that I saw the software, is that it has been just released. There's a lot of work to be done to make things a little bit clear on a little bit clearer on the interface, a little bit clearer for navigation as to not just how to do complex actions within Captivate, but also basic things like knowing where the Squarm and XAPI options are, which is very important if you're developing e-learning from beginning to end. If you're designing and delivering e-learning, you need to know how to start using the software and publish your e-learning module to your preferred LMS clearly, seamlessly, and there is some work that needs to be done. But overall, there is an interesting direction that the folks at Captivate are taking. Like you have noticed, it is not as much slide-based as they used to be. It is not very clear. It is not very consistent. The slide format, it is not the same every slide. If you have worked with Articulate Rise or Rise.com, it is essentially the same design approach, block-based design approach, template-based design approach, and there are advantages to an approach like that. It decreases the amount of time that you spend with nitpicky design things, which are things that I'm really fond of doing, that are part of my design process, adjusting elements as they appear on the screen. But one trade-off is that, like Alexis covered, accessibility is already built in, especially as far as the ease of providing alt text, the ease of providing tab ordering that is already built in, which is very nice. I would definitely recommend it down the line for rapid e-learning development, especially considering that if you only need it for a certain period of time, it is a good option because they do have a monthly subscription format. Feel free to ask any questions that you might have about the new Captivate. If you're working on a project that requires you to decide on an e-learning tool, and Captivate is in the mix of tools that you're considering, feel free to reach out to discuss the possibilities. Some of the things that we covered in this session are some of the things that you want to keep in mind. It's great for rapid e-learning development, even though it has some design constraints. Feel free to reach out. We're a resource that you can rely on, and have a great day.